And next, I'd like to invite to the stage our three panelists and moderator who are going to talk about ways that scientists are collaborating with artists, journalists, and others to widen the circle of public communication about climate change. First, I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Lisa Friedman, who is the deputy editor of Climate Wire, an online publication that reports on key issues surrounding the public conversation around climate change. Lisa also covers international policy, including global climate change negotiations, and has gone to the bottom of a Chinese coal mine and to the snow-capped Himalayas in pursuit of these issues. Her stories have appeared in the New York Times and Scientific American, and she has been a guest on a wide array of radio and TV networks. Lisa will introduce our panelists and get the discussion rolling. Welcome, Lisa.
I'm so honored to be a part of this. Thank you. I normally write about the sort of ugly politics surrounding addressing climate change, and so to be able to be part of a discussion about beauty and art, even if it's about distressing changes in the natural system, is really a joy. So I'm pleased to be here, and even more pleased to introduce a terrific panel of speakers who, as mentioned, are going to talk about the different ways to communicate some of the fantastic scientific research we just heard from Janet and Roger, and more broadly in climate science. To my immediate left, we have Peter West, who is the Outreach Program Manager for the National Science Foundation's Division of Polar Programs. He manages the agency's Antarctic Artists and Writers program, which I hope to hear about during this, which provides opportunities for humanities scholars to work in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. He's also an award-winning speechwriter at NSF and an award-winning photographer who has been to the Antarctic more than 10 times and to the North Pole twice. His photography from the polar regions has been published in many national publications. In the center, Courtney Madison. The most important thing to know about Courtney is that the fantastic, huge coral reef wall installation that many of you saw when you walked in, hopefully, that is Courtney's creation. She is an artist and ocean advocate working to inspire policymakers and the public to conserve the changing seas. She completed an interdisciplinary BA in sculpture and marine ecology at Skidmore College. She earned an MA in environmental studies at Brown, and she there worked with the Rhode Island School of Design to create the installation that you saw downstairs, and that hopefully you'll have a chance to see again when we go down for the reception. Finally, on the far left, Jesse Smith is a senior editor at Science, where he focuses on papers dealing with climate, paleoclimate, the atmosphere, oceans, and ice sheets. Jesse is a stable isotope geochemist and climatologist by training, PhD in oceanography from Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, and his research centers on understanding changes in atmospheric CO2 and their relationship to the climate. Courtney, I wanted to start with you. A lot of us were speaking, I want to call it backstage. Let's call it backstage. Artists have always captured nature, but what is it about climate change that you found compelling? Why was this an area that you thought should be and could be captured in an artistic sensibility?
Thanks, Lisa. I think you're right. Art has always been inspired by nature, from Da Vinci through history and until today. But I think recently artists have discovered that art really has a job to do. And I think in terms of environmental art, it's particularly powerful in inspiring people emotionally and cerebrally, but particularly to getting to the heart of conservation and why these environments are so important to protect. And so I feel like art has a really unique power to teach people about climate change in a way that doesn't feel like teaching. It's sort of just a source of inspiration that can spark curiosity and spark people's desire to learn more about the issues that are impacting our climate globally, from the poles to the tropical reefs and everywhere in between.
But when we talk about climate change, and some of the artists in the video that we saw touched on this too, I mean, we're talking about some very kind of complicated and to the average person, concepts. We're talking about, ocean acidification. We're talking about decrease in pH content in the Earth's oceans, coral bleaching. How do you, tell us a little bit about your process as an artist. How do you visualize these changes, and what inspires you?
Sometimes it's difficult. It takes a lot of thought to concisely kind of concentrate the idea of coral bleaching or the idea of ocean acidification into something visual that will speak to the viewer. And oftentimes it's not clear, and it's just sort of like the piece downstairs is supposed to show basically a transition from a healthy, living, happy coral reef at eye level up into the process of coral bleaching, where everything turns white and the corals become unhealthy as they lose their photosynthetic symbionts, these algae that live inside their tissues. And then the skeletons become bare as the corals die, and they become covered in this slimy green algae. Not everyone is going to know that immediately by looking at the piece, and so I hope that it at least inspires people to become curious about what it means, and then look into more information in terms of what the environmental impacts really are. And we were also talking backstage about how do you visualize ocean acidification, which is something I've been struggling with recently. I'd really love to do a piece inspired by ocean acidification at some point, but I'm still kind of marinating on that idea, because there are ways where I could create a ceramic sculptural piece where corals begin dissolving really dramatically, and sort of that might be the tact I take, but it's just an interesting thought process to think about what would be most impactful for people to see, to really understand ocean acidification and care about what it's doing to the planet.
We will look for that in the future from you. Peter, again, we were talking about earlier, the Academy of Athens. This was a story that came out about a month or so ago. They're launching a big project exploring how the great artists from Degas to Turner recorded the Earth's atmospheric conditions in their paintings. We've seen climate change pop up in the arts, in theaters, in movies. Most recently, Pulitzer Prize went to, the Pulitzer Prize in Music went to a symphony about sea level rise. Help us make sense of this trend. Why is climate change, do you think, what are you seeing in terms of people coming to NSF and hoping to explore this connection between arts and the sciences? Why is climate change an increasingly emergingly popular subject as an art form?
So there are a number of different aspects to the question, and I can only answer for my my rather large, but nonetheless parochial part of NSF. So polar programs, the Division of Polar Programs, is responsible for science at both ends of the globe, obviously. Obviously, those are the canaries in the coal mine. Those are the places that change is occurring most quickly. All of the art that NSF funds through the Division of Polar Programs is proposal-driven. So people, just as the scientists do, write proposals to us. We merit review those proposals almost exactly the same way that we would merit review a science proposal. And then we make awards of $1, just for the record, to the people that we send to the polar regions. We provide them, obviously, the logistical support to do that which they want to do artistically. And so I think that's the draw, that's the magnet. I would stress very strongly that we do get a lot of proposals that are from artists who are interested in documenting climate change, in working with scientists who are looking at climate change. But the mandate, the mission of the Artists and Writers Program is to reflect the full range of U.S. interest in the Antarctic. And so I have poets, I have documentarians, I have painters, and many of them are interested in climate change, and many of them make it through the process. But that's not all of the artwork that this program funds. So I think it is that issue. That is sort of, if you want to put it that way, ground zero for climate change, and therefore people want to go there and look at the conditions and the people who are doing the work.
And I'm looking at this as a layperson. Am I wrong? Is there not a trend happening, or are you seeing more people interested in climate change?
I would say that to be honest with you, there are more people interested in the program. There are. So I'm in a tough spot here because the person who ran the Antarctic Artists and Writers program for many years, who was responsible for getting it going, is sitting out there among you. So I'm sort of trying to be. I'm trying to say something, not to say something that would rile him. But over time, I've done this for 6 years or so. I wouldn't necessarily say that there's been an influx of people, of proposals related to climate change and art. There has been a large climb in the number of people applying to the program. Now, whether or not some subset of those people think, well, climate change is a big topic, and there's a lot of proposals, so if I put climate change in my proposal, whether that's happening or not, I don't know. So.
Well, we'll come back to some of the proposals specifically and some of the interesting things people are doing, but just as you present stories on some of these issues, what do you look for in images? How do you choose what kind of images to present? How do you choose what not to present?
Well, is my mic on? We choose images based on what the image is going to be used for. Of course, in a scientific paper, we want an image to convey as much information as possible. Images are great for conveying large amounts of information very economically, and because we're such visual creatures, in a way that's very effective. Also, though, we have to draw readers in to think about ideas more viscerally and more emotionally. So for covers, we choose images based on just how striking an image it actually is, rather than the amount of information that it conveys. In images is something I think that people can, it's like a hook that they can hang a scientific hat on. It's something that they can use to help them bridge the conceptual content of a paper with something more personal. So we have different criteria for different images in different situations.
A hook you can hang a scientific hat on, I like that. So it sounds like there are some ways where art can help communicate where even words can't.
Oh, absolutely. And now, so I work for science. We're in the process of, our job is to communicate scientific findings to a broad audience. And I promise you that our broad audience would be very unhappy if we communicated them only in words and equations, and that we didn't include images and art. We have a very large and active and capable art department who's peppering the pages of our journal with appropriate images all the time to draw in readers, to make a connection that can't be made just by verbal exposition or mathematical exposition. That visual presentation, I think, really establishes an important connection between a reader who is also a viewer of art and the science that is being communicated.
Speaking of a broad audience, we have a broad audience, and I don't want to monopolize this group. So, as we're talking, I'd love if people want to come to the microphone, and please feel free to ask questions of the panel. Do we have any initially?
Could I jump in on his point?
Please, yes.
So I was exceedingly happy, in fact, I smiled, at one of the slides that Dr. Jansen showed earlier. And the reason is that you can talk about art, kind of art that you do. You could also talk about scientific illustration. And the scientific illustration of the carbon cycle in the tundra was actually done by someone who used to work at NSF, who had I believe, a Master of Fine Arts in scientific illustration from Johns Hopkins. And that's exactly the sort of thing you're talking about. And the word, I think, I didn't use that word, but I think both of my predecessors did, was that art is visceral. But art also, in terms of climate, that carbon tundra cycle thing, what was the last, you had 3 images. The last one was 35 years out. So through art, you can show processes to people who don't or aren't familiar with graphs and those sorts of things over time. And that's what that illustration did. So we'll settle up afterwards for that. Thank you.
So this question, my name is Sarah Chu, and I have a question on behalf of a colleague who is this weekend leaving for a trip to the Arctic with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And her job is going to be taking the research that they're doing there and translating it into art and education. And I'm just wondering, we're talking about broad audiences. How do you find some of those audiences? How do you reach some of those? This is a new topic for her, and this is a new area, so she's not really plugged into the scene, as it were. So how do you reach out to new people and find those people that are going to be interested? Thank you.
That's a great question. Either of you, maybe where's your natural audience, and then where do you sort of try to seek a new audience of people that maybe don't even know that science art, if I could call it that, or climate art is something that their palette is interested in.
Social media has become so amazing in that sense, just in the last couple years. I mean, you can have a piece of art, a sculpture, a photograph, just as long as you have visual documentation of it, you can share it online, and people from Korea, from Russia, all over the world will find it somehow and just sort of be moved by it and share it with their friends, and it's really an amazing way to spread that message. So I would recommend looking up sci art. They're all different new terms for kind of art science. It's really a growing movement that is really alive online, and I think that's a great way to find new audiences all over the world.
Please.
Yeah, I have a question about activist art versus sort of the fine art, because there's a lot of activist art in climate change, and I wondered what you thought the role for that was, or how do you see these as different ways of communicating, reaching different audiences. So for example, I saw an image today it's by a Spanish artist, and he shows these men are sitting submerged up to their chins, discussing climate change, or politicians discussing climate change. And it's a very powerful image, which is very different, I think, than some of these very gorgeous but less direct types of approaches. Any thoughts about that?
I can do that one too. I think the line is getting blurred between activist art and kind of other beautiful art with a message, because if it has a message, then it's trying to cause a change, no matter how beautiful it is, I think. But I did see that piece, and I thought the men sitting in the circle, that was really interesting. I forget what it's called, but I think that it's a tricky balance between beauty and being thought-provoking and then being very doom and gloom, because climate change is such a depressing story, and it's the story kind of our lifetimes, and it could get really dark really fast if you only focused on kind of the hopelessness of it all. And I think that there's a lot of really amazing art being created right now that is aiming more towards the inspirational side of the story, and what we can still do in the next 10 or 15 years to drastically mitigate climate change. And we do need impactful images, and I think those impacts can be made through really kind of stark, sort of scary images that also have some sort of humor to them, like that piece, or also pieces that are just celebrating kind of the beauty and the fragility of the environment and what we're losing, and what we can do to help. So I think those lines are getting blurred.
Just to jump in, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because as someone who covers the international negotiations end of some of these issues, I find that there is a similar bent now towards not wanting to focus as much on just the threats posed by climate change, but also some of the opportunities of clean energy, and sort of tell not similar to what you're describing from an artistic perspective, tell not just the gloom and doom story, but the possibilities and the inspiration. So interesting. Question over here.
Hi, my name is Jessica Beals. I'm one of the artists who created some of the work downstairs, and I just wanted to pipe in a little bit because the last 2 points that you've been discussing relate directly to some of the work that we went through in preparing the show downstairs. First, social media, because that's kind of the quick one. One of the things we were thrilled about in getting the word out about this show was how quickly and enthusiastically people in social media picked up interest in the show and sort of took the conversation forward, not just in science-related tweeting and things like that, but also the Huffington Post. I mean, if you have a hot topic and you pitch it the right way, especially with good images, people are going to look. So that was really gratifying. Also, related to the beauty versus activism issue, that was something we struggled with quite a bit with this show because so much of the landscape and the microbes and everything that we've been discussing is just gorgeous. And you don't want to make something ugly on purpose to make your point. You still want people to pay attention. And so we struggled a lot with, is the imagery just compelling and pretty? How do we make sure that we make sure the message gets through that it's also something to pay attention to because of potential dangerous impacts in the future and things like that? So that was part of the whole process from beginning to end. How do you balance both of those issues?
Thank you.
I did want to jump in on the message point because you were talking about social media, which is a very good idea. NSF deployed 3 artists to Antarctica this past season. 2 went to Palmer Station, which is up by South America, and 1 went to McMurdo Station. All 3 of them, there was a glass etcher, a photographer, and a poet, which sounds like a joke, but it isn't. Or it could be, but all 3 of them blogged, and blogged regularly. One of them actually blogged quite a lot for Slate, so that way they got their message out, but also, unlike any time in the past that I can think of anyway, they were able to put representative works online and talk about what drew them to do this, or why they chose this particular thing to work on and not that particular thing. So there is that, and then I would be remiss if I didn't point out that one of the 2 criteria by which NSF judges which art to support in the case of my program is broader impacts. We look at the intellectual merit of a particular proposal, and then what are the broader impacts? What are you going to do once you've achieved that which you set out to do to make sure that the widest possible public is aware of it and is able to see it? And there are lots of different ways to do that. Galleries, exhibitions, that sort of thing. But certainly social media is part of that.
Also, hashtag AAAS cutting edge for tonight's event. We have time for one last question.
Yeah, as the 3 of you have been working with people outside of your discipline, what are some of the things that have surprised you most and help you see your own work and your original love for your work in a different way?
I think that's for you.
Okay. I'm kind of a personality that tries to just do it all. So I've always tried to be an expert in the science and the art side of it, and then draw inspiration from other experts when I can. And so it's been interesting because I have straddled this intersection of art and science, and often I'll be among scientists and they'll be like, oh, you're an artist, and then I'll be among artists and they'll say like, oh, well, you're the scientist. And so I never quite fit into either side, and so that makes those interactions really interesting because I'm never quite an expert in climate change as much as the real climate researcher that's taking ice core data and analyzing it, and vice versa. But I think that it's a really valuable way to kind of have that discussion and sort of relate a little bit in terms of what I do so that I can speak some of the language talking to scientists to get inspiration for my work, and then talk to artists and know the language of ceramic sculpture and kind of some art theory, and hopefully get that message across in my work also. So it's a fun dynamic that always changes for me.
Maybe Jesse, as the AAAS representative on the panel, I could give you the last word. Do you see artistic and homes and otherwise growing for people who want to capture both the art and the science of climate change?
Well, I mean, I think climate change is certainly one of the great challenges of our generation, and it's also going to be one of the great challenges of the next 50 generations too, because climate change is something that's going to be impacting us for many, many hundreds of years. So I would like to see everybody involved in the discussion. And certainly artists are an important component of that because art appeals to us on such a basic level. And any way that we can get a point across about climate change, I think is a good one. And art's just fun, and I love it. And I would love more involvement in the art community just for that reason.
Wonderful. With that, I would like to give our panelists a big round of applause.
So thank you, Lisa Friedman, Courtney Madison, Jesse Smith, and Peter West. And thanks to our distinguished researchers, Roger Anderson and Janet Jansen. Let's give all of our presenters one more round of applause, please.